Hello and welcome to Euro Truck Soliloquy. I am Annemie, and you have joined me again for this week's look at the interesting things that are happening in games, I guess. I am Annemie, this is Euro Truck Simulator 2, and the main conceit, as you might have guessed, is I talk about things that interest me for up to about an hour, depending on how rich the vein of this week's news is, and because it is January, the answer to that is not very, but we'll give it a go. We'll see how long we can talk. So on this journey, we are going from Luxembourg to Marseille, but for those of you who haven't watched before, the game is not what's important here. I'm not obeying most of the road laws, as you can see. I'm not worrying too much about that. I'm not worrying about sleep. It's just something to have on whilst I talk. And to hopefully not fail too catastrophically at. Okay. So what has been happening this week? Well, firstly, there has been a trailer released for a game called 2 Point Hospital, which is styling itself very much after the old Bullfrog game, Theme Hospital. Now, Theme Hospital is a game that I have a huge amount of nostalgia and love for, as do I think a lot of people of at least my generation. For those of you who don't know, you can probably guess from the name that Theme Hospital is a game set in a hospital. I believe it came before Theme Park World, but was very much in the same series as that, but was funnier. And just a little bit... I think it was a little bit more interesting. Where you'd run a hospital, you'd hire and fire your doctors, you'd set up your layout, and you'd buy sort of various machines and research different treatments for ailments that people would have. These ailments would range from the famous bloaty head syndrome, which featured people coming in with grotesquely oversized heads, similar to, you know, your standard big head mode, to the uncommon cold, to... I seem to remember there being something where people would think they're Elvis. It's been a while since I've played the game, in all honesty, but its massive strength was in its just complete and utter silliness, whilst being, at its heart, quite a serious and good management game. The key with a lot of these funny games is that you want the humour and the gameplay to support each other. You don't want it to just be... You can't excuse bad gameplay by saying, this is a comedy game. Comedy games have to be just as strong as serious games in their actual gameplay. And Theme Hospital was. I've not played it recently, so I don't know how well it's aged. My suspicion is not very well. Because if memory serves, Theme Park didn't age very well either. I think I tried to play that a few years ago, but there were some things that just didn't feel right, and other management games of the age, like Roller Coaster Tycoon, for me also haven't aged all that well. I remember having so much fun with them when I was younger, but it just breaks my heart to see that they're just not really up to snuff anymore. Mostly because they tend to look so arcane, and their UIs are really unintuitive. It's a similar thing with the old SimCities, one of which I tried to play. I think it was SimCity 4? I tried to play quite recently, and again, it was just... Nah. We've made so many advances which make games... just improve the usability of games. And people decry the streamlining and the simplification of game UIs as games becoming easier, and it's true. Games have become easier in that they've gotten rid of an artificial barrier to entry of you feeling like you had to study a whole degree in order to get into this game. I mean, that's the main reason that I've not really played Dwarf Fortress. Right, I've heard from a lot of people that it's a really good game. but it's just an intimidating prospect. It's why when I first played Crusader Kings, I didn't really like it. It had an awful tutorial, which just started to overwhelm you. But that's why a lot of the old games don't age so well. But this is one that I'm cautiously optimistic for. Well, not necessarily optimistic for, cautiously excited for, shall we say. I'm going to try and keep an eye on this one as best as possible. Again, been burned a little bit before because a lot of people have fond memories of Dungeon Keeper. And in particular, I have fond memories not for the first Dungeon Keeper, which I never actually played, but for Dungeon Keeper 2, which I played a lot of. I understand why people think it isn't as good as the original, but I don't have that point of comparison, so I'm stuck with the nostalgia for what might very well be an inferior game, but for me, is dear to my heart. So we had Dungeon Keeper, and I'm not going to talk about Dungeon Keeper Mobile here, but War for the Overworld, which is, again, very much a spiritual successor to Dungeon Keeper 2. And it had a lot of things which felt pretty similar. Admittedly, that was feeling pretty similar after about 10 years of not really playing a Dungeon Keeper game. But it felt as close as I remembered to, and it didn't feel good. It felt clunky, and it felt like there weren't really all that many interesting decisions going on. And I don't feel like that's necessarily War for the Overworld's implementation of it that is wrong. I feel like that's, from my memory, that seems to be pretty close to how Dungeon Keeper 2 actually was. And again, we've just made so many changes over the years that quite often people who decide to make spiritual successors will... Oh. Yeah, I could see that coming. Whoops. At least I've not damaged the cargo. Yet. But yeah, that's often something which people making spiritual successors overlook. They think, yeah, we've got to copy this over warts and all. And really, that's not why we love the games. For Dungeon Keeper and for Theme Hospital, the individual mechanics weren't what made it. It was the sense of fun that came with the games, a sense of play, the sense of... almost a sense of glee. Of seeing all of these funny features, these weird diseases and these strange sort of monster interactions, this captivating voiceover. It was that being framed in something which was good, which was mechanically good for the day. So that, for me, is the most important lesson to take forward whenever you're trying to recreate a game that you loved, is not to actually recreate it piece by piece. It's to say, this is what was good, and this is what we need to update for the modern day and age. So quite often when we think of modern spiritual successors, we think of a lot of the spiritual successors to things like Thief and to things like System Shock. For instance, Dishonored is very much a love letter to Thief. Oh, you know that. But it doesn't copy everything that Thief did, because Thief currently does not feel good. I know, because I tried to play it when I was an adult, many years after the game had originally come out, and after I was used to a lot of just sort of basic quality of life features that games had introduced, and it felt really quite clunky. Not in a good way. I had a very similar experience with System Shock. To a lesser extent, the original Deus Ex, I feel like that... it's not aged well, but it hasn't aged quite as badly. even if it looks like... it just looks atrocious. The original Deus Ex. But we have these spiritual successors, and in the case of Deus Ex Human Revolution, an actual successor to the original Deus Ex. And they took a lot of what was good about the original, but they didn't get bogged down in the stuff that wasn't. And we've got to remember that things progress for a reason. Sometimes advancements aren't good, like in the case of, you know, loot boxes and things like that. Sometimes we take steps backwards in terms of player enjoyment, but we can't just discard everything that's new in favor of making a graphically shinier version of the original. So that's my hope for 2 Point Hospital. Or at least I haven't seen any gameplay footage of it yet. The only evidence I've seen of it existing is a single trailer which reveals one of the new illnesses going on, which is lightheadedness, which is when you wake up one morning and your head has been replaced by a light bulb. Seems like a good enough idea for an illness. So yeah, keep an eye out for that one. One of the other things that's been quite excitedly talked about is Dark Souls Remastered. Now, Dark Souls is an interesting one for me. I've never played the original. Or I think I might have played like 5 minutes of it. But that was on a keyboard and mouse, and I quickly gave up on that idea, because you should never play Dark Souls with a keyboard and mouse. And it's an interesting one for me, because I love Dark Souls 3. I might be talking a bit more about my New Game Plus experience of Dark Souls 3 later. And there should have been a Inside Dark Souls 3 which went up yesterday at time of publishing. So I've been really enjoying Dark Souls 3. It's the first one I've finished. I got most of the way through Dark Souls 2 before just kind of not continuing. It wasn't at a boss, or I don't even think it was at a particularly difficult section. I think it was in Dragon Lake Castle. I think that's a place. And I just didn't pick it up again. Sometimes happens. I might go back to Dark Souls 2 now that I've completed Dark Souls 3, but so that's my Dark Souls history. And I've not picked up Dark Souls 1 ever. Part of the reason for that is that... So I picked up Dark Souls 3 in the Steam Winter Sales for £20. And I was thinking at the same time, shall I pick up Dark Souls 3 or shall I pick up Dark Souls 1? And I looked at Dark Souls 1 and that was still priced at £20. Which seems weird to me. Now, Dark Souls 3 was on offer and Dark Souls 1 wasn't, but I don't really understand why Namco Bandai would decide to keep Dark Souls that expensive for a game which is now quite old, seeing as it's getting a remaster. The other thing that puts me off is that I'm always a little bit wary about returning to older titles, mostly because you get used to, again, the quality of life improvements that they put in the later games. So, for instance, what I have been told, because of course I've never played the original Dark Souls, so I don't have first-hand experience of this, but the rolling is actually pretty different in Dark Souls 1, and I believe you can only roll in the 4 cardinal directions rather than having a bit more of a flexible roll direction in the later games, which for me, I think that would feel quite different, which makes me apprehensive of playing it. So I'd be interested to see if they decide to put any quality of life improvements in the original for the remaster, because you learn things and your original isn't gonna be perfect, even if it is still the most beloved in the series, to my knowledge. And on that note, I was reading an article earlier today on Kotaku, which was essentially a plea to not have these... to not have a particular quality of life improvement. And this one, it's one I've actually seen railed against quite a lot in the later Dark Souls, and that's the idea of bonfire warping. So those of you who don't know Dark Souls, it's a game. It's quite a difficult game. And one of the key features in it are these bonfires. They are essentially your ways of recording your progress, not via saving, but whenever you die, you return back to these bonfires, having lost all of your experience points, although you can pick your experience points back up. But these bonfires end up being your little hubs, your little mini hubs for exploring the world. You'll generally be at a bonfire, you'll explore in one direction. If you reach a dead end, you'll go back, explore another direction. If you find another bonfire, that's great, but you'll probably return to the previous bonfire and just explore all around the area until you're done looting everything, gathering all the lore, seeing what directions you can go to. And also, importantly, these bonfires also restore all of your healing items. So you get quite attached to them. They also, at a later point in the game, act as your fast travel system. So you can fast travel between bonfires once you've reached a certain point in the game. And in the later games, you unlock bonfire warping pretty much from the start. Now, the levels are designed quite differently in the three different games. In Dark Souls 3, for instance, you have quite a linear pathway through the levels. It's just, this is the first level, this is the second level, this is the third level. Sometimes you might get some branches. If memory serves, I think there is one branch of the critical path, and there are a few other branches into optional areas, which you can go into. So, if, for instance, you were in the last level and realized, there's an item that I missed, which one of my friends told me about in the third level, you'd have to do a lot of backtracking to get there. Actually, the last level's probably not a good example of that, because there is one more branch that I forgot about, but you get the idea. There can be quite a lot of space between you and the place you're trying to get to. So, because of the linear structure, so have bonfire warping. That works out well. The second game was closer to an idea of spokes on a wheel. So once you completed the tutorial area, you ended up in a hub section where you had 4.5 spokes leading off from there, not including the tutorial area that you went into. And each of those would be, I don't know, maybe about 2 or 3 zones long, not significantly more than that. Maybe one was 4 zones long, potentially. I can't quite remember. And so, again, you had bonfire warping, so you could potentially warp from the end of one of those spokes to the end of another spoke. It felt less necessary in Dark Souls 2 than it did in Dark Souls 3, but it was definitely a nice, convenient quality of life feature. In Dark Souls 1, the levels are much more entangled in some sort of strange geometry, where you'd constantly be opening shortcuts back to previous levels that you'd been to, and so you might have gone through a level and been like, there's a door that I can't open. It says, will only open from the other side. You end up forgetting about it, then 10 hours later, you'll walk through a door and be like, where am I? And you'll realize, oh! It was that door which couldn't open from the other side. Which is its own special feeling, and levels end up being much more interconnected, meaning that you don't necessarily feel the need for the bonfire warping as much. But So one of the things which would probably need to change is that the bonfire warping system in Dark Souls 1, it's not very good. You can't warp just to any bonfire. And also, the bonfires you can warp to are just displayed as a list of names. So you need to know the name of your bonfire. You can't just have a quick glance at a picture of where you're going to be going to. You need to know from the list where you're going to, and that can be a bit of a pain. By the way, sorry if you're hearing drilling or hammering sounds on the audio. There seems to be some DIY work happening upstairs. Not much I can do about that. So yeah, that's one of the things that would need to change. The other thing is that some NPC side quests in the game are somewhat convoluted and require you to be in specific places at specific points in the story in order to continue them. Which I feel could lead to quite a lot of backtracking if you want to actually get all of them. Because even though I said the levels are quite highly interconnected, there are still some which are quite far apart, and if you've decided, if you've sort of found this optional area, and you tried to go through it and it was just a little bit too tough for you at the moment, you could go quite a way away and not have a good way of getting back there when you felt more in the right headspace for it. So you'd be backtracking quite some way, and that's just a disincentive for exploration. I mean, I don't think that leaving out bonfire warping would be the worst thing, but I think that there are people who are acting as if it would be the worst thing in the world to possibly happen to Dark Souls. And that's just not true. Sure, you get more familiar by going back and forth through levels, but there's already enough back and forth if you're playing the game quote-unquote properly. Okay, this was a slight mistake. There we go. If you're already exploring everything, then you're going to be getting quite intimately familiar with the layout of the levels. And this is something which I really have discovered in Dark Souls 3. Where, so I said, I've completed the game, and now I'm on New Game Plus, and I'm finding actually that going through the levels the next time around is just so much quicker. It really does... Oh, should probably not have my lights on. It really does shout out to me that the difficulty in Dark Souls is not the inherent combat challenge. That's not what makes the game hard. I mean, sure, it makes the boss fights hard. Even then. But the inherent difficulty in Dark Souls, so it's not what you actually have to do, it's the not knowing what you have to do. It's the surprises, it's the enemies that are lurking around corners that you don't know are there, it's the boss patterns that you've not dealt with yet, so you have no idea how you're supposed to react to them. Dark Souls is all about teaching you that preparation is key, and if you know what's coming up through a level, you can race through that thing. So when I was first playing Dark Souls 3, I actually saw a speedrun of it. A full 100%, all bosses, deprived, soul level 1 speedrun. And this person completed the game in, I think it was like 4.5 hours? On my first playthrough, that was longer than it took for me to get to the second boss. And I was like, oh, I feel so inferior. And of course I was and still am vastly inferior to this individual who, you know, doesn't get hit at all through their run by enemy attacks. But I'm starting to feel now how that's a bit more possible now that I'm actually expecting where enemies are. And I find that really quite interesting, because there are a lot of games where, on a second playthrough, you'd end up taking not actually much less time than your first playthrough. So the games that I've replayed the most have probably been the Final Fantasy series. And those games, I know that a lot of them you can beat at base levels, and there are like no leveling challenges for things like Final Fantasy VIII and so on, but on the whole, the vast majority of people aren't going to be able to do a decent amount of damage to enemies unless they are at the appropriate level. And it essentially puts a grinding cap on your process, and I quite like grinding. I find it actually quite a therapeutic process. It's much like, for instance, playing Euro Truck Simulator. It's something that I can do whilst listening to something else. But it's interesting to me to see games where that doesn't happen, where you don't have this artificial padding. Again, I must reinforce artificial padding, that I like, but I also like the way that Dark Souls does it. And to say, yeah, you can beat me just as you are. You don't even have to be insanely good in order to do it. You just have to be prepared to, you know, die a few times. And spend... Or if you want to get really good and not get hit at all and do a complete run all the way through, you know, you have to spend a decent amount of time actually learning where everything is, but it's not that hard to run through levels not getting hit if you don't care about the items. I remember that for some bosses in Dark Souls 3, I got quite adept at sprinting quite some distance between a bonfire and the fog gate, just in order to be able to get into the boss room with all my resources still intact. So yeah, I think that we have to be a bit careful what we're so precious about with our original loves. And I think that even if they did include bonfire warping in the Dark Souls Remastered from the beginning, there is no reason why you have to use that until the story moment where you actually get it. It would be... You could have exactly the same experience as the original Dark Souls, and I feel like it's a little bit selfish to be like, but these new players who have never played it before, they won't have the same experience I did at first, they won't have had all the backtracking. And it's like, yeah, they won't, and they might still really enjoy the game. So let's just let people really enjoy the game, I guess. Now, another thing which seems to be getting a lot of press recently is Metal Gear Survive, which seems to be an interesting little game. This is the first Metal Gear, to my knowledge, that Konami have given us since Kojima left. And it appears to have very little to do with Metal Gear. I've got no issue with spin-off games. I think that if you've got an established series, then having some fun little digressions can be good. See something like Final Fantasy Tactics as a cool little spin-off game, or all the numerous spin-offs from Final Fantasy VII, or I guess what other spin-offs have I enjoyed, like the Gwent standalone game for The Witcher 3. I think that spin-offs can be fun. However, I think that after such a public departure of the person who has helmed the series, again very publicly, for a lot of people, Metal Gear and Hideo Kojima are almost interchangeable. So to have your way of continuing the series being a direction which you've never done before, not in that world, that is, in the words of Sir Humphrey Appleby, courageous. And I don't think it's entirely wise. Now, Metal Gear Survive might be a great game. For those of you who don't know, it's a survival game. Create your own character, you have to keep yourself fed and watered. One of the default states for modern indie games to be. And it does kind of look as if Konami went, oh, what's popular these days? Survival games? Well, we'll just put a Metal Gear skin on one of those and sell that. It just seems incredibly cynical and cash grabby, particularly as they seem to have lifted a lot of the assets straight from Metal Gear Solid 5. Or at least that's the impression I've got, and just created a game with no real connection to the Metal Gear series. It could be that Konami doesn't care what happens to the series and is essentially just trying to use the brand recognition of Metal Gear Solid in order to survive, in order to ship copies. But that seems like a very short-term point of view. And I wonder how viable this is in the long term if we don't see another stealth Metal Gear Solid. How long can the name keep propping up other sort of thematic indulgences? And speaking as somebody who... So, my history with Metal Gear Solid... I played Metal Gear Solid 2, I never finished, I didn't particularly like it. I finished Metal Gear Solid 3 again, didn't really like it. Didn't have a PlayStation, so couldn't play Metal Gear Solid 4. And again, didn't get Metal Gear Solid 1 when it first came out, because that was a PlayStation 1 originally, and I never had a PlayStation 1. My only television console has been a PlayStation 2. But Metal Gear Solid 5, I adored that game. I thought that was a wonderful stealth experience. And I actually really liked the way they managed to turn stealth into an open world game. I thought that was actually really quite daring, and it really paid off with the open world serving not as a distraction from the missions, but as a way to not only tie the world somewhat together, but also to give you more freedom of how you wanted to access different objectives. And I feel like Metal Gear Solid 5 actually was a game which brought a lot more people to the series. And then we're thinking, okay, really enjoyed that game. I wonder what Metal Gear's got for us next. Oh, it's something which has got nothing to do with the previous game. It's not a stealth game anymore. So that seems a bit of a shame to me. I hope it's a good game. I don't know whether or not it's going to be a good game. It could very well be. I just think that attaching the Metal Gear label to it is somewhat short-sighted. I think if they did want to tie it to the Metal Gear series, I think the smartest thing would have been to actually give it a completely different... to not have its name tie it to the Metal Gear series, but set it in the same universe and have some sort of subtle links together, and then if it ended up being a good game which people liked, you could end up tying the sequels more into the world. I'm thinking a structure possibly closer to that of how Portal and Half-Life are in the same universe. But it didn't feel like Portal was using Half-Life as a crutch to get people to play it. I mean, ignoring the fact that it was shipped in the orange box, but you get my point. Okay. So I think today is probably going to be a shorter episode as well. Not as short as last week, but I think I'm going to drop off this cargo and then stop it there. So in the rest of journey time, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about the games that I've played a little bit this week. So I've been playing Cook, Serve, Delicious, and actually later this week I'm hoping on Friday to have a video of Cook, Serve, Delicious 2 up, which is going to be a blind look at it, which I'm actually probably going to record later today. But I've been playing the original Cook, Serve, Delicious just to get a feel for the game and see what's changed and so on. And also because for some reason the bundle of Cook, Serve, Delicious and Cook, Serve, Delicious 2 ended up being cheaper than just buying Cook, Serve, Delicious 2 by itself. Which is a weird pricing scheme, but there we go. But it's quite a fun, almost hypnotic little reaction game. It's got a theme of cooking, as you might imagine, but you get a load of tickets and you need to play little mini games in order to actually cook them, and you need to do the right things in order to get more money. And it gets quite hectic, and I've got a few thoughts on this which I might talk a little bit more about in my inside look of Cook, Serve, Delicious 2, but then again I might also just focus on the newer game. But my first thought is that it actually takes quite a long time to see any initial advancement. So you get different stars of restaurants, and you have to do challenges in order to unlock your later ones, and you have to complete all of the challenges in order to do so. And the one that so I completed all of the first star challenges within the first 10 days, except for the last challenge, which was to essentially have 20 ink. Oh, whoops. I'm so glad that you just bounce off those without damage. So I did all of the challenges in order to get the first star on my restaurant, except for the challenge which required you to play for 20 in-game days. And it's just putting a timer on your advancement. Now, those advancement timers, the way they are used best for me is not as some arbitrary break. That just feels clunky. But as a system to reward just playing the game, even if you've not managed to complete any of the other challenges, it just means that, okay, you can have a bit of a reward for having played for this long. And it keeps people coming back for more in a quite Skinner-boxy sort of way. But if you're just starting a game, that is actually kind of fine. But it shouldn't feel like a drag on progress. You might often see in a lot of games that, what should I do next? Marseille to Strasbourg. That seems reasonable. Not going to do it today, but I might pick up the cargo. Oh, it's a decent way away. Where actually is it? Oh, it's all the way over there. Well then. So, yeah, as I was saying, it almost seems a bit of a maxim that you want to have early levels occurring a lot faster than later levels, just so you can have a sense of progression to actually get you invested in your character. And here your character is your restaurant, so you want that to be progressing at a decent rate. Now, you are getting unlocks throughout the game, but also these unlocks, some of them you purchase with money, others are just kind of thrown at you. So one of the basic ideas is that you buy food for your restaurant, you make your menu, and then each day you prepare the food that's on the menu, and you want to sort of rotate the stuff that you're making in order to get the most buzz, in order to get the most customers going into your restaurant. So you can unlock new foods by buying them, and you can also unlock upgrades by, again, buying them once the game has arbitrarily said, okay, you've been playing for this long, you've achieved these conditions, you can now get this upgrade. Now, quite often, these upgrades, particularly early in the game, aren't going to have anything to do with foods that you've unlocked. So it again feels like the game is just throwing things at you with no real consideration for what you want or for pacing. I think I would much prefer some form of, just some sort of experience, a visible experience bar, and then you get a certain amount of points to unlock upgrades for your restaurant or upgrades for your food and so on. And that would feel a lot more, it would feel like you have more agency rather than just going along with what the game wants you to do. But overall, I think these are sort of small missteps of the game, and the game it is fundamentally quite fun. And I was playing it in bed last night, actually, because I quite often bring my laptop into bed. And my partner was watching it and was actually finding it strangely hypnotic. Which is, a good thing, I guess. But it kind of put me in a bit of a focusing mindset, and it's got a really good pace to it, actually, where during each day you have a couple of rush hours where you get a lot of custom, and during the rest of the time you just get more of a steady drip. So you start off in the morning and you can warm up into your day before it gets a bit frantic, and then it eases off again, gets frantic later on, and cools off again finally. So you actually have I was about to say an interesting interest curve, but you actually have an interest curve going throughout the day where you're not just burning out or acting at a constant pace. There is an ebb and flow. Which, for a lot of these, I hesitate to say cheaper games, but so this is a game which, sort of design-wise, I would think wouldn't necessarily be able to place on something like Newgrounds. It would be a good game on Newgrounds, and I've spent a lot of time playing games there. So that's not a slight, it's just one of the simpler sort of games to design and make. What was I going to say with that? So, yeah. It's not a particularly complicated game, and something which a skilled developer could in some ways probably churn out. But this game actually seems to have had some care and thought put into its design rather than just, hey, this'll sell. And that does please me, because it really does show that there have been missteps. But the fact that the developers cared enough to try and put in a decent, for instance, a decent interest curve into the game, and had some ideas about rewarding players who weren't necessarily particularly good at the game with just sort of length of time progression, without any sort of monetization going in there as well, that makes me hopeful that the sequels can address some of the issues, and that they can be introspective about their project and say, yeah, we can do better. So I'm actually really excited to play the sequel. I know some of the things that it brings in, which I'm not entirely sold on, given that it seems to just be making the day potentially more hectic, but also potentially not. But yeah, it's something I'm looking forward to. I'm still playing Brothers, so my blind inside look of that went up. I think it went up last Friday. I want to say that was Friday's video. And I'm playing a bit more of that, and the controls are feeling a bit less janky. I still think that even though it's a neat idea, it hasn't worked out as well as it potentially could have. I think that the idea of using the analog sticks, using both analog sticks at the same time, is very much a learned ability. I've actually found this with my partner, who has been both playing Life is Strange and Hellblade. And they're not used to a controller. So they played Hellblade with keyboard and mouse. And they tried to start playing Life is Strange with that, but there was for some reason they couldn't actually start interacting with the objects. I think we couldn't figure it out, although I think while speaking here I've just figured out what needed to be done with that, but that was quite badly signposted. So I gave her a controller to use, and she'd not used it before. And I'm so used to people who have grown up on controllers that I'd forgotten quite how alien moving forward whilst panning the camera around actually can be. And Brothers is actually a prime example of how alien learning how to use a controller can be, because it is forcing you to relearn how to use the controller. And while I feel that could be used if you're deliberately trying to make the player feel uncomfortable, I don't feel like that is the design intent of Brothers. Just basic traversal of the world should not be... whoops. a challenge. You should be able to get around the world quite easily, and the using of the analog sticks is more to help you feel attachment to both of the siblings rather than feel like you're just controlling one and the other is tagging along, right? Oh. Hey! I'm keeping hitting these invisible walls. So yeah, I think I'm going to continue playing Brothers because I am quite liking the story. But yeah, it's not a particularly strong recommendation from me. But anyway, if you have enjoyed this video, this discussion of random topics that interest me, I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like. If you would like to see more content like this, or like my Let's Plays or my inside looks, it would be very much appreciated if you would subscribe to my channel. And above all, I hope that... oh, I just missed it! Okay, come on. I can get this. Oh, I've misaligned myself again, haven't I? It shows that I'm not a driver. Oh. Come on. I'm going to hook this thing up before this video ends. There we go. That looks alright. See if I can get back here. But yes, above all, I hope that you have a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye!